Okay, guys, so I am recording these for the STAAR review, the part one, part two, part three. They're all in Canvas under the STAAR review module on there. They're the super long reviews. We're doing them in class also. So this first one that I'm going through, especially, I'm going to try to go a little bit quicker since we've already gone through it in class, but just giving these as a resource for you to use in your prep for the STAAR test. You can watch it 2x speed on Canvas, kind of just listen through or catch, here or there where you missed in class what the exact answer was for this one or that one. So let me get my screen share fixed. Yeah, no, I don't care if it's the host. I'm the only person. There we go. So we're going to go through on this. I am not going to write in any answers. You're going to have to actually listen if you want the answers. No skipping forward and pausing to see what the screen looks like so you can just fill it in. And I'm going to give some surrounding context on these. So they're going to be long videos that go through in detail on all of these because the surrounding context is really what helps the most, more than just memorizing a list of dates and names. If you can put these events in context, you're gonna be able to get through the STAAR super easy. Okay, so first one on here, all of these, they're asking for the date of these events. Generally, if you can put these into a decade, like around the decade that these events happened, you should be in good shape as far as the actual timeline goes. You don't need to know exact dates other than a few key ones. So first one, Spanish-American War, late 1800s. 1800s, almost very close to the very end of the 1800s. It happens in 1898. Some of the big stuff going on around the Spanish-American War. Remember, this is the beginning of the United States getting involved in imperialism, should be what you're thinking of. The United States getting involved. We claim our territories like Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, Midway, Hawaii comes soon after. That's when we're getting involved in taking over those smaller countries to extract their resources. Should be thinking Teddy Roosevelt as our president that really, really likes that imperialism, all that kind of stuff, right? Remembering some of the stuff around why we entered into the Spanish-American War. There was that really important ship that got sank. The USS Maine was an important one that got sank. There was a certain kind of journalism that surrounded that. It's kind of like old school clickbait, yellow journalism, right? Covered the Maine. We don't really know if Spain intentionally blew up the Maine or not. Seems like it was probably actually just an accident. But that enters us into that war. So then we have World War I, the entire period from the beginning to the end of World War I. Remember, World War I starts in Europe first, right? World War I, guess on the decade, it's like 1910s is the decade that you should be thinking of. It's from 1914 to 1918. Everybody at the outset of World War I thought it was going to be a short war, right? But a 4-year-long war definitely wasn't a short war at the time, right? What slowed down World War I? There should be a type of warfare that comes to your head when I say what slowed down World War I. Trench warfare is what slowed down World War I. Thinking of some of our causes, that guy got assassinated. As we said in class, that dude got murked, right? Who is that? Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Archduke Franz Ferdinand got murdered. Him and his wife, Sophia, right? They took a wrong turn after he already had the assassination attempt. I think he's, gosh, how old is he? 17 or 19? 17-year-old, 19-year-old, somewhere, teenager. Gabriel Princip assassinates him, right? Imagine starting a world war in a couple years. Main causes, MAIN, militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, some of the big ones. We don't get involved in any of the world wars at the beginning of the world wars, right? We wait a while. We're where we like to be by ourselves, cut off from the other countries, isolationist before those wars start, right? So we don't get involved until 1917. We're barely in World War I, right? It ends in 1918, and we don't get involved until late 1917. We're barely in World War I, really. What are some of the things that get us involved in World War I, make us want to get in it? Well, we have that special relationship with Britain, right? That's some of the reasons why we end up on the side that we end up on. But we have a close relationship with Britain, right? Germany is kind of messing with us. They're doing something in the seas, right? That unrestricted submarine warfare. They agree to stop doing that with the Sussex Pledge, and then they break it. One of the big things that becomes a big news story is the sinking of the Lusitania, which has a bunch of civilians on it, right? So people get upset about that. And then they try to get somebody to join the war against us, right? One of our neighbors, Mexico. They try to convince Mexico to join the war against us. With that telegram that gets decoded, these Zimmerman telegrams, some of the things that get us into World War I, where the AEF, American Expeditionary Force, under John J. Pershing, right? Stock market crash. Should be thinking the stock market crash starts what? What does the stock market crash start? The Great Depression. It kicks off the Great Depression. You should know generally what decade the Great Depression was, the 1930s. It's throughout the entire 1930s. So if it's the entire 1930s, you should be able to guess around when the stock market crash is. Very early in that period. It's actually before the 30s, but 1929, right before the 30s. Remember, we talked about in class, the 20s is the party. We call it the Roaring 20s. That's the party. Depression's the hangover, right? Not feeling too good anymore in the 1930s. So 1929 is the stock market crash. The exact date is October 29th, 1929. There is also a term that refers to the specific day of the crash. It is Black Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. There are 3 different days that there's big dips. They'll reference kind of any of the 3. What I've seen the most is Black Tuesday and Thursday. Monday doesn't come up as much, but so if I just said stock market crash starts the Great Depression, and we have the next one, when's the Depression begin? It's 1929 again. Moving on. Entire World War II period from beginning to end, that includes Europe. And when it starts in Europe, again, we don't enter into World War II at the beginning of World War II. We wait a little while. We are isolationist, right? So 1939 to 1945 is our World War II period. World War II starts not because of an assassination, but an invasion of Poland by Germany. Poland is invaded by Germany. Remember, the German government had been pushing for more and more land. They took that Sundent land. They annexed Austria, right? That the British and the French kind of just let them have, right? They appease Hitler. That's that policy of appeasement. Kind of fails, and it leads to the beginning of World War II with the invasion of Poland. Why do we enter into World War II? Now, I said you're good mostly just knowing the decade of most of these events. However, this is one of the very few events that you really do need to know the exact date. You have to know day, month, year, and you have to be able to recognize that date. And that's the event that pulls us into World War II. We're going to skip down to 8 because it also gives us the answer on 7. That is December 7th, 1941. December 7th, 1941 is when the United States is attacked at Pearl Harbor, right? In Hawaii. It's actually before Hawaii is a state. Fun fact. But Pearl Harbor in Hawaii is attacked. and we declare war on December 8th. So we're in World War II from 1941 to 1945. Pearl Harbor attack, December 7th, 1941. We're in World War II much longer, right? Much more of an effect on the U.S. as we get through this review. Some of the more important things with World War II come up anyway, so I don't want to do a deep dive on that. We could spend 10 minutes of me just rambling. So launch of Sputnik, back to decades, fine. Don't really expect this to be one that most people remember the exact year of the launch of Sputnik. It's near the beginning of the Cold War, 1950s, 1957 to be exact, on the launch of Sputnik. What's more important is knowing what is Sputnik, who launched it, why is it important, what does it start? Some of those answers, it is the first satellite. The first satellite launched successfully into space. It's launched by the Soviets, the USSR, right? And it kicks off our space race. What are some of the things that happen as a result of that? Well, we get our government agency, NASA, and we focus a lot more on STEM in schools, math and science, right? Some of our effects of Sputnik. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. Again, not expecting you to know the exact year on this one. However, you should know the most prominent decade for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? He's most heavily involved in the civil rights movement. We know that he's at least involved in the civil rights movement up to 1964 and 1965, because we talk about the successful passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and those being things that he played a direct role in, right? And he's not actually assassinated until the end of the 60s, 1968. 1968 is when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, the end of the 60s, near the end of the big push of the civil rights movement. U.S. lands on the moon. U.S. lands on the moon, not really any tricky ones on this to remember. It's a while, obviously, you know, it's after 57, at least that, probably a while after, right? Because it's kind of difficult to make all that technology. We had the first satellite in 1957, probably not going to end up on the moon for a while. And it does take over a decade, not until 1969. 1969 is the moon landing that we end up going to. JFK doesn't live to see it, even though he's the president famous for saying, you know, we'll make it to the moon and all that. He unfortunately, you know, gets assassinated as well before he gets to see the moon landing. But Cold War ends. Cold War ends. Now, technically, we talked about in class, there's like the symbolic ending of the Cold War and then the like definitive absolute ending of the Cold War. Symbolic ending of the Cold War is kind of with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Fall of the Berlin Wall. That happens in 1988. Or no, sorry, 1989. That happens in 1989, I think. Is fall of the Berlin Wall. Remember the separation, East-West Germany, separation of East-West Berlin. Big deal when that falls. But the official 100% end is when the Soviet Union dissolves. That's not until 1991. 1991, fully Soviet Union dissolves. There's no more big bad guy for us to fight in the Cold War, right? We are definitively the #1 world superpower. Cold War ends. So when's the Cold War begin? Should be thinking it happens right after a major war. The Second World War happens. Technically, the specific date is 1947 is what most historians will say is the beginning of the Cold War, 1947 to 1991. Supreme Court declares presidential winner. We covered this in our last lesson of the year with new content. We talked about this election. There's a lot of controversy over what's going on in Florida, right? The ballots are kind of weird. They're paper ballots with those hanging chads. We don't know what's going on with them. We saw that those butterfly ballots that looked like they were made by an insane person. And then the votes are crazy close between the two candidates. We have George W. Bush, George Bush Jr. and Al Gore, and there's 500 votes separating them. That's insanely close. on a presidential election for an entire state, right? Most presidential state elections come down to thousands of votes, right? A close presidential election would be like 10,000 votes making the difference, right? That's still pretty close. You don't say that you really handily won a state unless there's hundreds of thousands of votes in your favor, or 800,000. But this is the election of 2000 between George Bush and Al Gore. Al Gore wants a recount. Bush doesn't, because Bush was in the lead, right? The Supreme Court basically decides no recount. There's no more time for it. And we're going to move forward. Bush is the winner. That's the end of it, right? Election of 2000. Terrorist attack on the World Trade Center / Pentagon. You guys know this. We talk about it every single year on the day of it. It's 9/11. 2001, September 11th, 2001. There are the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon, Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda. We have the war on terror as a result. We enter into Afghanistan and Iraq. Shortly after Afghanistan, we enter almost immediately. Iraq, we don't enter into that war until 2003. Talk more about that later, but you should know that one. Election of Barack Obama. Well, Bush had his first election in 2000. He is a two-term president, not like his dad. He showed off, beat his dad out as a one-term president. A little embarrassing, right? Bush gets the full 2 terms. Bush Jr. gets the full 2 terms. So he's not out of office until 2008. That's when Obama gets elected, right after George W. Bush. So scrolling down, this section will go a little bit quicker. I don't talk as much about the background on these ones, but those dates, there's so much, right? Those are really big events. Want to cover a lot of that stuff. But what is the significance of the motto, E pluribus unum? We haven't talked about this since the very beginning of the year. You shouldn't feel bad if you don't remember this one. It's not massive. It is out of many, one. E pluribus unum is out of many, one. Might be some different meanings for that. If you think about the name of our country, what is it? The United States of America. Maybe the many in that is the states, the one being the country. Out of many people, one nation, right? Kind of means, coming together and being unified. Out of many, one. Why was the motto "In God We Trust" added during the 1950s at the height of the Red Scare? I had a lot of people in class today that I think made a smart connection and said, people are afraid of nuclear fallout, that there'd be a nuclear war. Maybe they get a little bit more devoted to religion. I think that's great thinking. Not actually the reason. The reason on this is the Soviet Union basically banned organized religion. We talked about that quote from Marx, who kind of was the philosopher behind communism, said, religion is the opioid of the masses. So it gives you an idea of the belief in communism of religion, basically saying like it's an addiction. It will pacify people, is kind of what he's saying, because if you're on opium or opioids, you're kind of, drugged out, not thinking. So no organized religion in communism. And the Soviet Union, well, we want to be different during the Cold War. We're better than them in every way. We're different from them in every way. Can't have anything seem similar to the USSR, right? So they don't like religion. We put "In God We Trust" as our motto. Got to be different, right? So that one's "In God We Trust" as the motto. What was the purpose of the Declaration of Independence? It's in the name. What are we doing? Declaring our independence, right? The little bit more on that is we're also saying why we want to be independent, saying what we're mad about, our grievances, listing the issues that we have with Great Britain and why we want our independence. But, face value, declare our independence, right? Why are the signers of the Declaration of Independence seen as acting courageously? Again, little bit face value. What are they basically starting? A war, right? They're starting a war with who? Great Britain, who at the time is at least one of the top 3 world powers, right? Most likely can be seen as the most powerful country in the world. A little bit of competition with Spain at the time, but very least one of the most powerful countries in the world, right? And we're starting a war with them. We're a little baby colony that's been started by the British, right? That's pretty scary. Can be seen as brave to tell them, you know, we're not going to take it. We're starting this war. No more taxes. Well, no more unrepresented taxes. From whom does the government of the United States claim its power? Who should it be claiming its power from? Who trades the following of laws and ordinances for that power? We do, right? We trade listening to all these rules to give them power. Like we listen to their rules so long as we give them the power to enforce those rules, basically, right? So they derive their power from us. What are they supposed to be called? Congress people, senators, the president. They are our elected representatives. They're our representatives. We vote them into office. They're supposed to represent us, right? What are the 3 unalienable rights listed in the Declaration of Independence? This gets quoted a lot, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What's unalienable mean? You can't take it away. It's God-given, right? That's what they claim, right? Do you really have any God-given rights? Are you guaranteed any of your rights? Not a religious statement, more on the, are you 100% guaranteed rights? Not really, right? You have the rights you demand the government gives you, right? We see that with the civil rights movement. We see that with a lot of the movements that we talk about in U.S. history, that you have the rights that you're willing to demand and force other people and the government to give you, right? And the founding fathers prove that, right? They say those are God-given rights. They believe they should be God-given rights, but what did they have to do to get them? Fight a war, right? So, little diatribe. But what did our founding fathers fear most about establishing a new government? Well, what was the government they just escaped from? What did they think was the problem with the government they just escaped from? It was a monarchy. It was tyrannical. It was run by a king. They don't want to have another king, right? That's why Washington steps down after 2 terms as president. He wants to set a good example and say, hey, we can't just hold on to power forever. We should let go after a little while. The blank divided our government into 3 branches, the blank, blank, and blank. Well, what is our foundational legal document? What sets all of the initial federal laws and rules? The Constitution, right? And then you guys should know your branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial. You should know those by now. That's like kindergarten. You start learning that. Not you'd have it memorized by kindergarten, but you start learning that throughout your entire education. So by now, hope you hold on to those. This branch of our government is especially important since it ensures that the other 2 branches follow the Constitution. Who gets to decide what is and is not constitutional? Well, we talk about this all the time. When do we bring up the Constitution the most and whether or not it's being followed? It's with our Supreme Court cases. What branch of the government is the Supreme Court? The judicial, right? Every time we talk about a Supreme Court case, we bring up one of the amendments, or does this follow the Constitution? And they decide, yes, it does. No, it doesn't. Here's a new constitutional rule that we kind of have to follow. Why was the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution? Well, it's in the name, right? What does it give us? Rights. It's the Bill of Rights. It's to protect individual freedoms and rights. Okay, that's the point of the Bill of Rights. Why did members of the Constitutional Convention place provisions in the U.S. Constitution that allowed it to be amended What does it mean to amend something? It means to change it, right? Well, what happens over time? Things change, right? So if our society changes, our ideas change, our values change, what is agreed to be morally right and wrong changes, what else should be able to change? The law, the Constitution. The founding fathers said, we think things are going to change over time. Our Constitution should be able to change over time to address that. What document and 2 successive pairs of amendments proved most helpful to the development of the civil rights movement? Now, it says this in a little bit of a confusing way, I'll be completely honest. The document that it's talking about is the Constitution. I'll just be straight up on that. It says in a weird way, they mean the Constitution because they're asking about the amendments to the Constitution. Now, a lot of students, when I ask this question, the first one they think of is First Amendment, which I think is a great answer in general. That is not in any way a bad answer, right? Because what's mostly happening during the civil rights movement? Protest. What gives you the right to protest? First Amendment, right? This question's more getting at what gives the legal justification for the laws that are passed, right? What gives the constitutional basis for changing the laws as a result of the civil rights movement? Well, what are some of our main laws that we're changing? What's the big parts of the civil rights movement? What's the main goal of the civil rights movement? Main goal of the civil rights movement is to end segregation. Well, what was the problem with segregation? How were people being treated? Very unfairly, right? They were not being treated equally. We talk about with Brown versus the Board of Education, separate but equal is inherently unequal, right? Well, what amendment guarantees equal treatment of all citizens? That is the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment has the equal protection clause of all citizens, okay? So that changes a lot of our laws. And then the other big push in the civil rights movement, voting rights. Well, voting rights for people of color specifically. What amendment guarantees voting rights for people of color? Should know it. It's right after the one I just talked about, 15th Amendment. Outlaws denying voting on the basis of race, color, or creed, or former status of servitude. I forget the exact phrasing. But remember, 13, 14, 15, free citizens vote. Outlaws the practice of slavery outside of punishment. 14 is citizens, outlines and defines citizenship and the protections of citizenship. That's where you get the equal protection clause. 15, vote, the right to vote. So scrolling down, I said this in class, I'll say it again. This is one of the least important sections of the entire 3 reviews, honestly, is this list of names. Knowing a list of names can be great in some contexts. Don't spend a ton of time trying to memorize these names and the things they're attached to. It's not going to help you that much for the test. Knowing the historical eras, important events, and how those events affect us and all of that, way more important than being able to list off a set of names, okay? So number 1, largest signature on the Declaration of Independence is a symbol of freedom. A lot of students just know this one because it's kind of a pop culture reference. They sometimes call a signature this a John Hancock. Is the first one. One of the first chief justices of the Supreme Court wrote some of the Federalist Papers, or helped write them. This one is John Jay. John Jay is the first Supreme Court justice, or chief justice, sorry. Father of American medicine. This one does come up sometimes. He is fairly important. It is Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush is the father of American medicine. Critical thinking moment here. French philosopher. I could cut it off there and you might have a good guess as to who the answer is. What's the only name on this list that sounds French? Well, it's not the 5 Johns, so you can cut them off, right? Might be that guy Alexis de Tocqueville. Does that sound a little different, right? Sounds a little French to me. But French philosopher who wrote Democracy in America, which lists five items critical to setting America apart: liberty, equality, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire policies. We'll talk about those in the next section. That's how important they are, right? They get their whole own section of the review. So might be a name you want to remember out of those. Clergymen who recruited volunteer soldiers to fight the British. It's John Peter. Doesn't matter. Going to be completely honest with you. Colonial governor who sided with the colonists against British and remained governor after. This one is a little bit more important than at least John Peter. That is John Turnbull. Turnbull. Always say his name wrong. John Turnbull. Founder of Princeton University. This is John Witherspoon. And then if you've been keeping up, that should leave only one option for helped finance the war and all of that. That is A, Charles Carroll. The last one on it, it is A, B, E, and G. A, B, E, and G. Carroll, Hancock, Rush, and Witherspoon. Scrolling down, almost halfway through, right? Match these characteristics of what Alexis de Tocqueville was talking about with the actual name or term. So we have, we're going to go through on 10 through 14, and then we're going to match one of the terms with each of these. So 10, the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. I think there are a lot of good answers, or at least two. I don't think a lot. There are two good answers for this one. What edges out the correct answer on this is when it says on one's way of life, behavior, and political views. We're getting specific about your personal beliefs and those being different from other people, making you an individual, or the individualism of American society. Society of equals. Which of those words looks like it kind of says equal a little bit? Which one looks a little bit like it's spelled the same way and might have equal as part of its root word? Egalitarianism, right? Egalitarianism, equal, talks about a society of equals. The participation of the common people in political life. Goal was peace and prosperity for all. Again, participation of everyone. Which one in there sounds a little bit like it might be related to this? Maybe populism sounds a little bit like popular or population. Everybody being involved. It even says popular sovereignty right there. Might, have to do with the participation of the common people or everybody in society. People were free to flourish without hereditary distinctions, and individuals believed they could rise in society. Example, you personally, talking to you, you could be president, right? We don't have hereditary social roles. What's hereditary mean? When you talk about hereditary, you talk about it in biology class mostly, right? How do you get your color of eyes? Well, that's hereditary. You get it from your parents, right? Hereditary social roles would be talking about being born into like a caste system like they had in old school India, or being born into a royal family, maybe, right? In America, we don't have that. We have liberty. We are a country of liberty where we aren't born into those roles. Again, if you're matching correctly and keeping up, there should only be one option left. But the policy that allows businesses to operate without the interference of government. What's all about hands-off government in our economy? The hands-off government in our economy is laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means hands-off government in the economy. So going on to our third party politics right here. So it goes across, we're going to match each of the candidates with their political party in this one, and then we're going to match the platforms with the political party. Okay, so we're going to go through on this one. Number one, William Jennings Bryan. Talked about him in the first semester. We actually talked about him twice. He was a presidential candidate, and then he becomes the lawyer in the Scopes monkey trial. But what political party was he part of? Well, he was part of the political party that comes from the Grange movement. Ooh, that's a tricky one. Way back that we might not remember. Comes from farmers and the common people, and they blend into this populist movement. William Jennings Bryan is a populist presidential candidate. Then we have Theodore Roosevelt. He was a politician during this era of politics. He was a very popular member of this political party. He actually runs as a third party candidate for his attempt at the third election to president. Something about the Roosevelts wanting that third term in office. He doesn't get it, but FDR does, right? But that is the Bull Moose party that he starts, but he is considered the progressive candidate or the progressive party. He calls it the Bull Moose party. Historians later kind of term it the progressive party in general. I'll just tell you, Ross Perot's an independent and Ralph Nader's the Green Party. They're less important than the Populist Party and the Progressive Party. Those are the two more important ones out of the political parties to know. You should, based off the name though, if you take a look over at those party platforms and main ideas, one of these should be very easy, and it is the Green Party. Should very easily stand out as number 7, right? Force attention to environmental issues. Green, environment, come on. But going over to number 5, silver coinage, direct election of U.S. senators, and a graduated income tax. Who believed in all of those things? They wanted to get rid of the gold standard. We have William Jennings Bryan giving our cross of gold speech, right? And wanting to get rid of some corruption in the United States with the direct election of senators, gain some taxes through a graduated income tax. That is the populist party. Should have been tipped off when I said William Jennings Bryan gave the cross of gold speech, but they don't stick around for a long time, the Populist Party. However, they are successful in having a pretty big impact because 2 of these 3 things on this party platform become constitutional amendments. We do directly elect our senators, and we have a graduated income tax thanks to the 16th and 17th amendments, right? So they do have a big impact in their short time as a political party, the Populist Party. Federal budgets must be balanced, and the government has a a fiscal responsibility. It's the Independent Party with Ross Perot. Now, technically, the Independent Party doesn't have a platform. Independent literally just means you don't subscribe to one specific political party. This was Ross Perot's platform when he ran as president. But to give you an idea, Ross Perot, who's considered a conservative, pretty conservative guy in general, identifies as an independent. Somebody you guys might be familiar with that also identifies as a independent is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, definitely not generally considered a conservative politician, right? So independent doesn't really nail you down politically. We already said 7 was Green Party. Again, if you're keeping up, that should mean number 8 is the Progressive Party. Called for major government reforms, including regulation of bad trusts, social welfare assistance for women and children, and workers' rights. The Progressive era is a response to the Gilded Age. We talked about the Gilded Age as all of that corruption, terrible working conditions, monopolies, all of those things going on, right? Progressive era is a response to that. They're trying to end a lot of those practices. The other thing that we can talk about with this is number 5, our Populist Party kind of inspires some of the ideas of the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party actually helps pass some of those amendments, the direct election of U.S. senators and the graduated income tax, so that that populist party doesn't stick around a long time, because they also blend into the progressive movement. Why do third parties form? They form most of the time because there's a specific interest that people have, right? That's not being satisfied by the dominant political parties. Meaning, in today's context, there's an issue that Democrats and Republicans both don't really care about. They don't talk about it. They don't address it. They don't give it any attention, right? So this party starts to form, let's say, just something stupid. People really start caring about the speed limit. They think, the speed limits that we have, they're just way too high. We need to lower our speed limits. I am a one-issue voter, and that is the speed limit. And the Democrats and the Republicans, they don't talk about the speed limit. So I obsess over it. That's all I talk about. And I start my own political party to kind of get people to care about the speed limit. That is what I start my political party about, right? So that's kind of why they form in general. Over time, what will happen with them forming over these specific issues is the other dominant political parties, once these get popular enough, the third parties get popular enough, the other political parties, the dominant two, will say, well, hey, there's a lot of people interested in that speed limit party. If I start talking about the speed limit, I might get those voters, right? So if I'm a clever Republican or Democrat and I'm a politician, right, I would say, there's a lot of these speed limit third party people. Might be nice if I just start talking about the speed limit and take all those voters, right? So that's kind of what happens with third parties over time. The other thing, the unintended consequence of the third parties, we talked about this with the election of 1992. We talked about this with the election of 2000, right? Whoever the third party candidate is closer to politically, they kind of tank that person's chance at becoming president. In 1992, Ross Perot was closer to being a Republican, so he kind of tanked H.W. Bush's chance at being president, right? Because he splits the Republican vote. Republican voters have two choices, where the Democratic voter only has one, right? Now, that sounds bad at first if you're the Democratic voter. And honestly, as the voter, that is kind of bad that you only have one choice and the Republicans get two choices, right? They get to pick somebody more closely aligned with their actual beliefs. But for the politician, that's an advantage, right? My voter base isn't being limited. Might be kind of why the Republicans and the Democrats don't want there to be third parties. They get a bit of an advantage from it being just a two-party system, right? Which technically it's not a two-party system. You're allowed to have whatever parties you want, but there's two parties. Right. So that's the unintended consequence. They split the vote. Split the vote. So getting over to our World War I and World War II. So basically what you got to do on this one is you'll go through and you'll identify the statements as either being part of World War I or part of World War II. You're going to circle any number of the items that are causes of World War II. You will box anything that is in effect. So that might sound confusing at first, but we'll kind of go through it. So what you're going to do next to any of these is, as you're going through, if number one, I'll tell you right now, because we actually talked about it earlier, Great Britain and France were doing this with Germany, right? They appeased them. This was World War II. So you can just write it next to the number World War II. And then was this a cause or an effect? Well, we talked about appeasement happening before the war. So if it's happening before the war, it's probably a cause, right? So then you would box number one. So that is a World War II cause. So you put WWII next to it, and then you box. Some of them will be a little bit questionable on whether or not it is a cause or an effect. If it is, I'll say so. And I mean, for my class, if you're watching this in my class, I might be sharing it to the other teachers. They can use it if they want. But my class, I'm not going to care a ton on those ones if I'm saying it's questionable, obviously, right? So European trench warfare. What war was trench warfare the main type of warfare in? We also already mentioned this. That is World War I is the main type of warfare, is trench warfare. We get that nasty trench foot, right? When it floods, it slows down the war quite a bit. This is an effect since it's happening during the war, right? Once the war started, we end up with trench warfare. That's an effect of the war starting. And remember, why don't we have trench warfare anymore? Why does it go away after World War I? What ends trench warfare? Tanks, tank warfare, right? They can go straight through no man's land, no problem. And that kind of ends trench warfare. Hear my dog back there. So World War I, an effect. Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, again, we already talked about this one. It causes the United States to enter into World War II. What date was that? That's one of the only dates you have to memorize, right? December 7th, 1941. Now, you can think of Pearl Harbor as a cause of the United States entering into World War I. However, it's kind of an effect because it happens after World War II starts, right? And it happens because we cut Japan off from oil, right? We put sanctions on Japan, which cuts them off from their oil supply. Why did we put those sanctions on them? Because Japan was at war with our allies, or people that were soon to be allies in the war with. So we cut them off from oil. They make that surprise attack against us at Pearl Harbor, and that enters us into the war. But that really is an effect of World War II starting, because we're not in World War II from the beginning, just like with World War I. So World War II effect. Woodrow Wilson, this is a person. None of the people are going to make sense on cause and effect. That's one of the things. Don't put down a cause or effect on a person. That doesn't make any sense as far as a cause or effect of the war. Woodrow Wilson, World War I. Woodrow Wilson, World War I. All the W sounds together, right? Some alliteration for us. Woodrow Wilson, World War I. He was the U.S. president during World War I. He comes out with those 14 points that I see a little bit later on. So I'll talk more about the 14 points when we actually get to it. But Woodrow Wilson, World War I. I also might tell you what the answer is on that one. But Zimmerman telegram, again, Zimmerman telegram, we already talked a little bit about, I mentioned it earlier, as a cause of us entering into World War I. Remember, Germany sends over that encrypted message to Mexico, trying to get them to enter the war against us. Mexico says no, basically. They don't even respond to it, actually, which is they get ghosted, or Germany gets ghosted by Mexico. But they don't want anything to do with it, but the United States sees, hey, Germany's trying to get Mexico to enter war against us. That's a little freaky, right? Pisses a lot of Americans off, causes us to kind of enter into the war. Again, it is a cause of the United States entering into the war. Technically, it's an effect of the war itself, because Germany is already at war and they're trying to get Mexico to join. So it's a cause of us entering. It is an effect of the war itself. That'll get a little confusing, right? But again, we don't enter at the beginning of the war. Doughboys, pudgy little doughboys. They're soft. Who is getting called soft? Those World War I U.S. troops, right? Because we don't enter until the war's already been going on for 3 years. It's 1914 to 1918. We don't enter until 1917. That AEF, American Expeditionary Force, is getting called a little bit soft. They're calling them doughboys, right? That one is going to be World War I. World War I, right? Sorry, I have something in my eye. Okay, there we go. So we have the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act. We start lending out and leasing what to who? We lend and lease military weapons to the British and French. This one is World War II. World War II is the Lend Lease Act. And it's kind of us dipping our toes into the war. We actually do this before we declare war, but we're starting to get involved, right? Then we have the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen, again, airmen should give you a tip off. When do we have more plane warfare going on? When do we have full air forces happening? It starts a little bit in World War I, but mostly our airmen and our air force for sure is World War II. Our Tuskegee Airmen are World War II. Who were the Tuskegee Airmen? Why are they important? Who are the Tuskegee Airmen? Why are they important? It was the all-black troop of pilots, right? They were so good at their job. They started being requested by everyone on their bombing raid escorts, right? More of an effect of World War II, right? We're in World War II already. That's why the Tuskegee Airmen were formed. They definitely don't cause World War II to happen. Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Again, one that we already touched on a little bit. That is the cause, the spark that sets off World War I. Archduke Franz Ferdinand getting assassinated. It is the spark that sets off World War I. If I'm calling it the spark that set it off, that should be pretty clear that it is the cause of World War I. Rosie the Riveter, flexing her muscle, right? Showing women can do it too. We can get the job done while all those men are off at war. We can get these industrial jobs done. That's Rosie the Riveter in World War II. Again, if it's happening during the war and happening because all the men are gone, that is an effect of World War II. That's an effect of World War II. Give me 1 second. I need to get a drink of water. Sorry. Starting to lose my voice a little. So our amphibious landings, there's one specific invasion that we really use the amphibious landing with that's really important. The largest land, sea, air invasion of all time that we'll talk about a little bit later. The amphibious landing is most important in World War II. World War II. Again, this would be an effect because it's a type of warfare used during. You'll notice the vast majority of these are effects. Flying tigers fight where? Who do they help? Where are they fighting? Where are the fighting type flying? Sorry, the flying tigers helping fight. The flying tigers are helping fight in China, helping fight against the Communist Party in China a little bit at first, but fight against some of the, helping fight in China in World War II. Again, an effect because they're soldiers fighting. I'm going to pause my recording. I need to go blow my nose really bad. How do I have to pause share first? Okay, here. Can I just forget how to pause recording? Not end. Pause recording. Back. You can't stop me. Okay. So we were at flying tigers. Adolf Hitler. Again, people are weird on cause and effect. Doesn't matter on this guy. The correct one, this should be easy. Hitler is World War II. Come on, you should know that. Pacific campaign. Where do we get involved a lot in the Pacific? Specifically against, I'm actually going to turn that light off. It's annoying me. Sorry. Here, let me just. Pacific campaign. When do we get involved in the Pacific, right? Why are we getting involved in the Pacific? Who attacks us that makes us fight in the Pacific? That is Japan. Which war are we fighting against Japan in? That is World War II. That's an effect of the war that we end up in it. Executive Order 9066, right? Probably the only executive order that you really need to know. That is the executive order signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II. What does that executive order do? It forces all Japanese Americans essentially into those internment camps. We force them out of their homes. They lose their possessions, all of those things, and are forced into those internment camps. We end up with the Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States, where essentially they're saying, hey, this kind of breaks the Fourth Amendment, right? Unreasonable search and seizure, not really reasonable to say I lose all of my possessions and am sent into an internment camp just because I am Japanese American, right? Breaks the 14th Amendment, that equal protection clause. We're not being equally protected as citizens. And what does the Supreme Court say? It does, but we're at war, so we can kind of do that. Is what Korematsu versus the United States kind of says. So a little bit messed up there, right? Victory gardens. What are you going to plant a victory garden for? To make sure that we're conserving food, to help with the rationing effort that's going on during World War II. Another effect of World War II. I don't think I said it for executive order. That's also an effect, right? But victory gardens, an effect of World War II, part of our propaganda campaign, right? Remember, propaganda doesn't always mean evil, bad thing that's going on. It just means government-produced media, right? Victory gardens are part of our campaign effort and our propaganda effort to help win the war. Sorry. Get water again. First income tax is technically related to World War I. I don't think my class really talked about that very much on the first income tax being related to World War I. It's an effect of it. We got to help pay for that war, right? Income tax gets passed during it, but not something that we directly talked about. Franklin D. Roosevelt, already gave this one away earlier. We should know it. He is the president during the Great Depression and World War II. First president to ever serve 4 terms as president, right? He gets elected at least to 4 terms. And then what happens to him right at the beginning of that 4th term? He dies, right? Dies in office. Harry S. Truman becomes president after. But we get which amendment because of Franklin D. Roosevelt? Because of those 4 terms that he serves, that 22nd, 2 terms, 22, 2 terms, 22, 22nd Amendment because of Franklin D. Roosevelt serving all those terms. Sinking of the Lusitania. We already talked about the sinking of Lusitania being a cause of us entering into World War I. Sinking of the Lusitania, entering into World War I. Germany doing all of that unrestricted submarine warfare. Again, it's technically an effect of the war because we don't get involved until after the war starts. It is a cause of us entering the war, though. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What happens to Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, Hiroshima and Nagasaki have nuclear weapons dropped on them. The only 2 cities to ever have a nuclear weapon used on them in warfare during World War II. They're dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So that is an effect of World War II. We have Japanese internment camps. Again, just talked about this. You could look up a little bit higher at the Executive Order 9066. Well, those are our Japanese internment camps, an effect of World War II. First use of unrestricted submarine warfare. I've talked a little bit about this. It was related to the sinking of Lusitania. What country is mostly known for that unrestricted submarine warfare? That's Germany during World War I, right? Try to trick you a little bit. Use in World War I. Cause for us, effect of the war. John J. Pershing, General John J. Pershing. He is the commander of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. World War I is John J. Pershing. Again, cause and effect doesn't make sense for people. Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project is the project to develop the atomic bomb, the nuclear weapons, right? That is in World War II. That is an effect of World War II that the United States wants to make it. Remember, we get that letter from Einstein saying, hey, the Germans are trying to make a nuclear weapon. Like, watch out. You guys should probably do the same thing. And Project Manhattan, we make the first nuclear weapon, the little boy. So invasion of Normandy, D-Day. I referenced this earlier. I didn't say the name, but I referenced it with our amphibious landing. It is the largest land, sea, air invasion of all time, right? This is in World War II. It's the invasion of Normandy in France. We're trying to reclaim France from the Nazis, from Germany. We're taking Europe back. This opens up a new front. We invade from Britain into France at Normandy and spread out into the rest of Europe. We've already entered from Northern Africa into Sicily and Italy. We're pushing from underneath. We then invade into France, and the Soviets are coming in from the other side. We got them surrounded. We start ending the war through the invasion of Normandy. Navajo code talkers is really important, right? When you're in war, you need to communicate to your soldiers, to your generals, coordinate the attacks. What's the risk of sending out those communications and coordinating? Well, the enemy might pick up on those communications, right? So what do you want to do with your communications? You want to encode them. You want to make it where the other guy doesn't know what you're talking about, what you're planning. Well, the best way to do that is with the Navajo code talkers, because the Navajo language was never written. There is no form of the Navajo language in Europe at all, right? They're a Native American tribe in the United States. So this code is never broken during World War II. World War II is the Navajo code talkers, mostly used for the Pacific Fleet, but very, very important, very helpful, never broken, really helps us with our victory in the war. Navajo code talkers, pretty cool story on the Navajo code talkers. Final solution, the final solution to what? What is this a part of? Well, technically it is a final solution to what is called the Jewish question. This is an anti-Semitic trope, the Jewish question, right? What do we do with the Jewish people? Well, the final solution to that is the genocide of all Jewish people during the Holocaust during World War II, perpetrated by Nazi Germany, right? Nazi Germany perpetrating the Holocaust against German Jews, European Jews in general, as they start invading into other countries. Is it just Jewish people killed in the Holocaust, though? No, it is not just Jewish people, right? There are 6 million Jewish people killed as a result of the Holocaust, along with Rumnishel and Romani people, Slavs, the communists, political prisoners are killed, gay people are killed as a result of it, right? There are a lot of different groups, 12 million people killed in total by the Holocaust, 6 million of those being Jewish people, 6 million being made up of those other groups that we've mentioned. Island hopping. What was the strategy? Oh, this is an effect, right? Sorry. I get a little bit bad about doing the cause and effect. For the most part, they should be obvious. And there's not very many causes, if you've noticed. Island hopping. The island hopping strategy was where we kind of take each island as we go for a launching off point for our next attack. Where? In the Pacific Fleet, in the Pacific theater of which war? World War II. This is our strategy against the Japanese, right? You need refueling stations for your Navy. You need for them to be able to stop off, get food, oil, gas, all of those things to resupply their ship and launch further into the Pacific area. One of the biggest ones of these is why Hawaii was so important, right? Why the Japanese attacked it, why the Battle of Midway is such a big deal. Once we take Midway, that's midway between the United States and into Asia, Japan, all of that, their coasts, right? So very important there. As I was kind of getting a little ahead of myself, Battle of Midway is World War II, right? It's an effect of World War II along with the island hopping strategy. Turning point in the war against the Japanese. Once we take that Battle of Midway, we break the Japanese code. We know they have a surprise attack coming, not like Pearl Harbor this time. We know about it. We can plan for it, and we actually turn the tables on them. and we win that Battle of Midway. Fascism is a part of World War II. Nazi Germany and Italy are both fascist dictatorships, along with the Japanese Empire by some is considered a fascist country during World War II. Fascism is known as a cause of World War II. The rise of fascism in Europe causes World War II to happen. Our 14 points, we're finally over to this after I talked about it with Woodrow Wilson, which again should let you know which war is this. If I'm saying Woodrow Wilson is the writer of the 14 points. The 14 points was kind of a strategy for peace after World War I, saying this is how we would prevent another world war from happening. The big thing out of the 14 points is Woodrow Wilson argues for the creation of the League of Nations. If you don't remember what that is, it is the failed attempt at something like the United Nations. Why does it fail? We don't join. Woodrow Wilson wants it to happen, but the Senate doesn't. The Senate votes no to the League of Nations because after World War I, we go back to what kind of politics? Isolationism. We want to be isolationist after World War I ends. I'm going to pause real quick. 1 second. Okay, I'm back. Oh, sorry, I was looking ahead. We were on 14 points. I was talking a little bit about that, the League of Nations, everything. Okay. Lost Battalion. When was the Lost Battalion? This comes up every once in a while. The Lost Battalion. Sorry, my iPad went on. What's happening? Okay, that's not important. Sorry. Lost Battalion was World War I. They come up every once in a while. They're a Lost Battalion, basically. Is kind of the name, tells you what you need to know. But the historical period that's important for is World War I. Same thing with daylight savings. Daylight savings comes about as a bit of an effect of World War I. We passed our first bill on daylight savings. That rarely comes up, but daylight savings, an effect of World War I. The Holocaust, we've already talked about. Holocaust is connected to what? The final solution. The Holocaust is perpetrated. It is a genocide or an attempted genocide against the Jewish people, not just Jewish people, but involves them. Korematsu versus the United States, another one we already talked a little bit about, right? Korematsu versus the United States happens because of Executive Order 9066 and the Japanese internment camps. We get Korematsu versus the United States, where we said the United States kind of says, that does violate the 4th and 14th Amendment, but we don't care, unfortunately. But Korematsu eventually ends up getting apologized to by the United States, and he's given a medal. I think he's given the oh gosh, it's the medal that's given. It's the highest distinction for civilians is the Medal of Freedom, I think, if I remember it correctly, Medal of Freedom. But next one, war bonds. How do we pay? How do we help pay for the war? War bonds. You sell out those war bonds. If you remember Captain America, in the first Captain America movie, he goes around on that USO tour trying to sell war bonds. This is technically the World War I and II. We got to pay for both wars, right? What's a good way to sell it? War bonds. We get what to sell war bonds? Propaganda is trying to sell us those war bonds. Again, propaganda doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. It can be a very bad thing, but it's not always a bad thing. Just government produced media. We get our generals of World War II. We're figuring out what description helps describe the World War II general or person. This guy's actually not a general, but they're mostly generals. The World War II figure, rather, and what theater they were mostly involved in. So our first one here is, sorry, hands hurting. Our first one here, I think it's better. Let's just do Pacific and European theater first. Let's rather do Pacific and European theater first, and then we'll attach them. So Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower is in which theater is Eisenhower most important in? Well, he's kind of the head of which invasion? Dwight D. Eisenhower plans what invasion? Eisenhower plans the invasion of, wait, is it Eisenhower? Remembering correctly. Yeah, Dwight D. Eisenhower is the planner of D-Day. That is in the European theater. Dwight D. Eisenhower is the planner of D-Day in the European theater. Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur is known as the head of the military in the Pacific theater. MacArthur is the head, or Douglas MacArthur is the head of the military in the Pacific theater. Omar Bradley, mostly known for tank warfare. Omar Bradley helps us fight also in the European theater, not using a ton of tanks in the Pacific theater. That's mostly what kind of warfare? The naval warfare, right? Because it's a bunch of island hopping and all of those things. We have George Marshall. George Marshall is a little unique. George Marshall is not a general. He is actually going to be technically kind of both the European and the Pacific theater. We'll talk more about this guy, George Marshall, when we get into these descriptions over there and why he's both. But he's a little unique. He is both. Chester Nimitz. He is the head of our naval forces. Well, if Chester Nimitz is the head of the naval forces, what theater do you think he's involved in? Maybe the one named after an ocean, right? That's going to be in the Pacific theater, is Chester Nimitz. George Patton. I misspoke earlier. So sorry. Omar Bradley's not the tank guy. See, I do it too sometimes, but we remember, if you mess up on a test question and you realize it later when you see it, you look at that. George Patton is the tank guy in Northern Africa. Omar Bradley is more important with D-Day as well. Sorry, both of them are European theater. I remember that correctly. Said the tank thing. Tank things, George Patton. My apologies. John J. Pershing. John J. Pershing is going to be involved in our European theater in World War I and partially attached to World War II, really World War I. But that's the European theater. We don't have a Pacific theater in World War I, do we? Flying Tigers, we also talked about them. Where are they mostly fighting in? They're fighting in China, mostly. So technically not Europe, but that is going to be our European theater. Asia and Europe connected to each other. Should probably just be one continent, but tectonic plates, you know. Our European theater, Flying Tigers. Tuskegee Airmen, again, already talked about them a little bit. That's in World War II. Our Tuskegee Airmen are mostly in our European theater as well. So, Chief of Staff, who helped form and equip the Army and oversaw the project for the creation of the atomic bomb. This is the guy that I said was a little unique, is technically both European and Pacific theater. That is our George Marshall, is the organizer of victory, is the nickname that he gets. Organizer of victory is George Marshall. African American Fighter Group, who provided escorts for pilots on bombing missions. We should know this one already because I described them a little bit earlier. That is our Tuskegee Airmen, right? That's our Tuskegee Airmen. Commanded 1st American Army to land in France during our Normandy invasion. That was my correction I made a little bit earlier. That is actually Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley is the commander of the 1st American Army in the invasion of Normandy. Commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet and commanded U.S. forces at the Battle of Midway. Well, we said this already. He's in the Pacific theater. He's the head of the Navy. That is Chester Nimitz. Chester Nimitz is in charge of our Navy in the Pacific Fleet. Commanded American Expeditionary Force during World War I. This is our only World War I guy that we already talked about. General John J. Pershing. John J. Pershing, American Expeditionary Force, head of our forces in World War I. Commander of U.S. Army fighting in the Pacific. The Army fighting in the Pacific, to be specific, is Douglas MacArthur. So, mostly naval battles, but we definitely still need land troops once we get to those islands, right? So who's going to be in charge of those troops once we actually get on the islands? That is Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur is the commander of the army fighting in the Pacific. Commander of forces that invaded northern Africa, Sicily, and known for experience in tank warfare. This is George Patton. George Patton is known for tank warfare in World War II. Remember, tank warfare ends that trench warfare that we had in World War I, becomes very important in World War II. George Patton, known for his fighting in northern Africa. Supreme Commander of D-Day and Allied invasion of Europe. Who is the head of D-Day? Who is the planner of the D-Day invasion? That is Dwight D. Eisenhower, right? Later becomes president from his fame in our war in World War II, gets a lot of prestige, known very well by the American public. Dwight D. Eisenhower, planner of D-Day, goes on to be president. Volunteer American fighters supporting China with war material. Now, who's the only person left? Who's the only group left? Haven't talked about them. Flying Tigers, right? Flying Tigers, volunteer force that helps with China. Moving down. We're almost done. Two more of these big sections. And then this one's super easy. We'll finish out that one super fast. So this one, I like this one a lot. Identify the following statements as pertaining to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or both wars. Which one do we kind of get involved in? Which one's related to either Vietnam, Korea, or both? So let's go through. JFK sent military advisors. Well, JFK doesn't become president until after one of these wars has already ended. One of these wars ends in 1953. JFK is not president in 1953. So there's only one war that JFK can send advisors for. That is the Vietnam War. Vietnam War is the one that JFK is involved in, right? We start kind of poking our nose into stuff that's going in Vietnam a little bit. Why are we getting involved in both of these wars in general? The Cold War. We don't want communism to spread in those areas. JFK is worried about that. He believes in something that we'll talk about in just a minute. So he gets involved there. Truman is the first president to commit support. Now, again, with our timeline that we should have in our heads, who dies and makes Truman president? Well, that's FDR. So he's going to be an earlier president, right? He's president at the very end of World War II, right after World War II. He gets us involved in the Korean War that starts in 1948, right? That gets us involved in the Korean War. Goal to contain communism. Now, which war is that? Where we're trying to stop a northern country, right? There's this division between the north and the south of this country, and the northern country is communist, and we don't want them to spread into the southern part of that country and also make it communist. Now, if you're confused on which country I'm talking about, that's because it's both Korea and Vietnam, right? We get involved in both of them because we want to contain communism, right? That is a both. You can put a B next to that one. Domino theory. If one country falls to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia will fall to communism. Now, technically, this is one that you could kind of put both on because that's, again, the goal of containment. But we talk a lot more about the domino theory with Vietnam. We talk a lot more about the domino theory with Vietnam. Credibility gap. Americans beginning to distrust their government. Well, what war out of these wars do we kind of lie our way into and then have our presidents continue to lie to us while we're in them, right? That is the Vietnam War that we get that credibility gap, people starting to distrust the government. We get that because of LBJ and Nixon, Richard Nixon. So that gives you an idea. I just mentioned LBJ with which war? He escalates our involvement in the Vietnam War. LBJ escalates our involvement in the Vietnam War. He's not president. LBJ, who died and made LBJ president. I'm going to repeat that one because, again, JFK gets assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. Well, we know that JFK wasn't president until after the Korean War. If I remember our timeline as we're going through, that has to be Vietnam War. United States left before a clear winner, right? Stuff gets a little hot. We start realizing that maybe this war is not going to be able to get won. There's kind of this division between the North and the South country. I'm repeating myself on this North-South thing. The fight for communism, don't know whether there's a clear victory. Again, it's both. Again, it's both, right? With Korea, the war never ends. We still have that demilitarized zone. There's no clear victor in the Korean War. Unfortunately for the United States, there is a clear victor in the Vietnam War, and it is not us. It is not South Vietnam. It is North Vietnam. We lose that war. Also continuing to open up that credibility gap because we're losing that war that we're involved in for so long, right? People distrust the government a little bit more. Left us with a demilitarized zone. Again, getting ahead of myself. Just gave it away. Which war ends with a demilitarized zone? Doesn't really end. Still going on today. The Korean War. We have that DMZ at the division of North and South Korea at that 38th parallel. The 38th parallel divides North and South Korea. We have the demilitarized zone there. Northern part of the country was communist. Well, I've said this a couple of times. You should know it already. Which war involves a northern communist part of the country that's trying to spread into the South? Both of them, North and South. The Korean and Vietnam War, both have that spread. 26th Amendment was passed. What's the 26th Amendment do? 26th Amendment lowers our voting age to 18 because, this war is getting really unpopular. And a lot of people are saying, I'm old enough to be drafted and sent to fight and die for my country, but I don't get a say in how it's run. How ridiculous is that? That I can be told that I have to die in a war that I get no say in. What's that BS about, right? So which war gets a big anti-war sentiment about it, gets a lot of people riled up and wanting to change the government? That is the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War leads to our 26th Amendment. Ho Chi Minh Trail, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Well, which government is run by a guy named Ho Chi Minh? The government of North Vietnam is run by Ho Chi Minh. The Ho Chi Minh Trail helps supply the Viet Congs in South Vietnam. And that is a big part of the Vietnamese War with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Kent State tragedy, the Kent State massacre, as it's also known, right? Kent State massacre is when there's a big anti-war protest at Kent State in Ohio, right? Well, which war did we say gets really unpopular and has a huge anti-war sentiment behind it? That is the Vietnam War that we have that happen at, right? And those Kent State protesters are killed, and it increases the anti-war movement quite a bit. Military leader was MacArthur. Military leader was MacArthur. Our military leader being MacArthur is the Korean War. He wants to bomb Korea with the nukes, right? Getting a little brazy there, getting a little crazy. Wanting to nuke. It's actually China and North Korea that he wants to use the nuclear weapons against. Gets a little crazy, but Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I referenced this earlier with us lying our way into the war a little bit, giving the president at the time full military powers, right? We claim that northern Vietnam bombed us without being provoked. We end up finding out later that ship was aiding South Vietnam and actually was running bombing raids on Vietnam already, right? So they just attacked back. LBJ doesn't tell Congress about that part, and we get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed that gives him full military power to intervene into Vietnam as he sees fit. We don't lose that Gulf of Tonkin resolution until much later. I'm checking to see if the other one is on here. It is not. With what piece of legislation? The War Powers resolution gets rid of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Gulf of Tonkin gives war powers resolution takes them away. Nixon promised to win this war. Well, when's Nixon become president? That's after LBJ was president. Which war is LBJ involved in? LBJ is involved in the Vietnam War. So if Nixon is president after LBJ, it has to be the Vietnam War, since the Korean War was first, right? That timeline really helps us out. I don't even have to think about it if I already know my timeline that I go along with, right? Very, very important to get that timeline nailed down. Know the order of our presidents to appoint. Media impacted public opinion. Now, one is a better answer, but technically these can be both. The media kind of reports on that falling out between Truman and MacArthur and kind of affects some of the public opinion in the Korean War. Much more heavily affects things in the Vietnam War, though, right? We get the live reporting of this event that takes place, this big surprise attack that we'll talk about later as I'm looking over there. And we kind of see the war as pointless, and it helps support kind of the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. Napalm being used to burn down the jungle of this country, because there is a specific type of warfare that again is later in there. There's a specific type of warfare that's really popular during this war that is aided by all that jungle cover. So we want to burn down the jungle, get rid of it, right? So we use napalm in the Vietnam War. We use napalm in the Vietnam War to burn that jungle down. The 38th parallel, already referenced this. This is the dividing line between North and South Korea. This is where we get our DMZ, or demilitarized zone, is at the 38th parallel. Police action kind of gets referred to in the Vietnam War. I'll just tell you that one directly. The Vietnam War is where we get our police action being referenced, a little bit referring to events like Kent State tragedy, also the military action of the president, but this police action being tied to a war is going to be more the Vietnam War, because we have the big anti-war movement, right? Well, I said we're going to reference a type of warfare. Here's our type of warfare: guerrilla warfare. What is guerrilla warfare? Guerrilla warfare is those surprise attacks, going back, hiding in the jungle, going into the rat holes in those little dugout tunnels throughout Vietnam. This is used by the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese forces that are known as the Viet Congs. The Viet Congs are the South Vietnamese that support communism. They're mostly surprise attacks. They're not wearing uniforms. We don't have front lines, right? You could be attacked by what they call them also Charlie, right? You're always looking out for Charlie, the enemy. And they could, attack from behind, run into the trees, go into one of those holes, go through the tunnel system, pop back up, and flank you, right? This is our guerrilla warfare. This is why we're using napalm and Agent Orange, that chemical, to destroy the jungle of Vietnam. We want to get rid of the ability to use guerrilla warfare in Vietnam. And then again, our Tet offensive, I was referencing this earlier with the media impact. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, right? The Vietnamese New Year, normally a day of celebration in Vietnam. Well, it was a day of celebration for the Viet Congs, that's for sure, with the massive surprise attack that they launch against the United States. They seize a ton of different cities, including the capital city of Vietnam, Saigon, that they hold not very long. They actually don't hold a lot of the territory that they take in the Tet Offensive. However, because of that media coverage that we have on it, people see us lose all of this territory and they think war's pointless. And it adds to what? The anti-war movement that we have in the Vietnam War. So that finishes out our Korea and Vietnam section. One more, guys. Telling myself too. I'm ready to hear myself stop hearing myself talk. Also, I promise it's annoying to me also. So what we're doing is we're going through and we're going to assign each of these things with a historical era. So we're going to look and see what historical era do we most associate monopolies with? What historical era is the Truman Doctrine related to, right? I love this section. If you can ace this section, you can ace the STAAR test. Being able to identify specific events, characteristics, laws, and like trends that are going on during different historical eras. If you can do this well, honestly, if you like this and you can do this well, you should be a history major if you want to go to college. Like this is, if you're good at this, you are good at history. Listing a memorized thing of dates and names, not very impressive, honestly. That's rote memorization. That is just boring and not very interesting. Being able to actually recognize historical trends, what's going on, identify when it was going on, the impact of these things, when they were important, why they were important, that's impressive. That shows that you know what's going on. That is a sign that you'll be able to ace your test and actually do something with the information that you have, right? So we have our progressive era, the expansionism era, that's like westward expansion, right? The New Deal, the response to the Great Depression, our Cold War era, that's a big era, right? From 1947 all the way up to 1991, but there are some trends of the Cold War. And the prosperity of the 1950s and the civil rights movement. So we'll go through and we'll assign each of these a historical era. So out of these, which one did we talk about monopolies a lot? Well, technically, we talked about the forming of monopolies in the Gilded Age, not one of the options on here, but one of the options on here is a response to the Gilded Age. One of the options on here is when we tried to break up these monopolies, get rid of them, make it where one company isn't in control of an entire industry, right? That is the progressive era. The progressive era is when that happens. Expansionism, looking at number 2, expansionism is actually going to refer to imperialism. Sorry. Expansionism is actually referring to imperialism, not westward expansion. It could be both, just saying expansionism, but this is going to be more imperialism because we're talking about the USS Maine. The exploding of the USS Maine gets us involved in what war? Spanish-American War. What do we start doing after the Spanish-American War? Imperialism or expansionism. So we're going to get involved in that after the exploding of the USS Maine. There's a type of journalism that we'll talk about in a little bit, looking ahead, that has a lot to do with the exploding of the USS Maine. Number 3, the Great Depression. Well, I literally said when defining one of these eras that it was solving the Great Depression. What tries to solve the Great Depression? The New Deal. Who enacts the New Deal? Who is he on here? Are we going to talk about it later? No. Whose plan is the New Deal? FDR. What is the New Deal? Bunch of job programs, basically. Job programs and reforms. Relief, reform, recovery, right? The 3 R's of the New Deal to get us out of the Great Depression. Bunch of job programs, bunch of regulation. The Marshall Plan, What is the Marshall Plan? What are we trying to do with the Marshall Plan? What is it a part of? It is a part of stopping the spread of communism. We cannot allow communism to spread throughout Europe. What's that going to be related to? The Cold War. Now, what is the Marshall Plan specifically, though? Do we remember? What are we trying to do in Europe? Well, we said after World War II, most of Europe is in ruin, right? They've been in a war for 6 years with bombing campaigns that's gone on, that's destroyed cities, right? And we said when people have the option between starving to death and becoming a communist nation, they're probably going to pick being a communist nation over starving to death because their country is in ruin, right? Well, let's make it where the option isn't between starving to death and communism. Let's go in and let's give Europe a bunch of money. to help them recover from World War II so that they can become what kind of country? A capitalist country. The other thing, where is it easiest to spend US dollars? The United States. Well, if we're loaning out a bunch of US dollars to all of these European countries, we're going to have them spend it in the United States. Not only do these countries like us because we loaned them a bunch of money, they now become our trading partners where a lot of that money comes back to, and they don't become communist. Win, 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 right? That is the Marshall Plan. Stanford B. Dole. Stanford B. Dole. Stanford B. Dole is the president and the governor of Hawaii. He is related to what guy that starts what company? The banana company, right? Dole, the pineapples and bananas and all of that, that's in Hawaii. This is part of imperialism, right? He overthrows the queen of Hawaii to put his own government in place. And then he starts telling the United States government, hey, you should make this place a territory and then a state. Hey, you should make this place a territory and then a state, right? So this is all part of expansionism with Stanford B. Dole. Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws. What are Jim Crow laws? What do? They are basically the racist segregation laws, right? They're the laws that keep segregation in place, put those unfair treatments on Black people and people of color in general throughout the United States. And what era responds to these laws, tries to get these laws repealed and taken away? That is the civil rights movement era, right? Jim Crow laws are taken away, gotten rid of during the civil rights movement. Next one, tenements. Do you remember what our tenement housing is? What living in a tenement is like? We watched that video way back, right? Looking at what a tenement housing kind of looked like, where you're all packed in on top of each other. It's those apartment buildings in industrial cities in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where a lot of immigrants live in general, where people are kind of packed in on top of each other, really gross living. We have that video about the fleas and lice that would live on people in these packed in conditions and everything, right? This is part of the Gilded Age starts building up the tenements. Who responds to the Gilded Age and tries to get rid of tenements? The Progressive Era. The Progressive Era, remember, I'll always kind of reference those two together because they really are very attached. You can almost call the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age one historical period. That's kind of the beginning and the end of it, but Gilded Age happens first and the Progressive Era's response to that Gilded Age. Sit-ins. What is a sit-in? What's the point of a sit-in? What are you doing in a sit-in? Sit-ins are a form of protest, right? You go in to a restaurant or a building, a business, a service that's being provided that is a segregated business, and you go in a group of all people of color or in a group of Black and white people together. You sit down, you ask for service, and you wait until they provide you service, right? If they deny you service, you continue to sit there. If people start berating you, you start to sit there and wait. This is a form of civil disobedience, right? Breaking what you think is an unjust law in a peaceful way, right? An unjust law is no law at all to me, right? So that is civil disobedience. The sit-in movement happens during, should be very obvious, the civil rights movement. Truman Doctrine. Truman Doctrine is very similar to something that we already talked about. The Truman Doctrine offers military aid instead of financial aid. It offers military aid to anyone threatened by communism. Anyone threatened militarily by communism, the Truman Doctrine provides military aid for them. So if we're fighting back against communism, take a guess. It's the Cold War, right? That one, again, should be obvious once I describe what it is. Montgomery bus boycott. Who starts the Montgomery bus boycott? My class should think of one name, won't be on the test, but Claudette Colvin, right? Doesn't get the credit she necessarily deserves. Claudette Colvin, the teenager that actually gets denied, or sorry, actually denies giving up a seat to a white lady first. She goes to the NAACP, talks about it. Who's the secretary of the NAACP? That is Rosa Parks. The NAACP later decides, hey, we're going to use this story, but we need an adult representative for our story. Rosa Parks does the same thing. She gets arrested, kicks off the Montgomery bus boycott as part of the civil rights movement, right? Remember what a boycott is? Do you remember what a boycott is? Denying to use a service that you think is doing something wrong, right? You protest with your wallet, right? You say, hey, we're paying the same price as everybody else for this ticket. Why aren't we getting the same service? Well, if you're not going to give us the same service and let us sit wherever we want, not going to use your service, right? High unemployment. This one should be easy. When do we have the highest unemployment in U.S. history? When do we get up to almost 25% unemployment? Crazy high unemployment rate. When do we get that? The Great Depression, right? That one should be fairly obvious for us, that the Great Depression is when we have crazy high unemployment. I referenced this earlier, our yellow journalism. When do we get a lot of yellow journalism? What is yellow journalism? It's our old school clickbait, right? Some salacious headlines, get you real interested in what's going on, but we kind of exaggerate what's actually going on to sell those papers, baby. Got to make some money. Woo, let's lie about some stuff to sell some papers, or exaggerate things to sell some papers. Well, what did we already say? We exaggerated what might have happened with the type of journalism, the exploding of the USS Maine. What era is the USS Maine's explosion in? That's in our age of expansionism. So again, knowing our timeline, how these things are connected, once you remember one, you can remember the other, and put these all kind of together to make it much easier on yourself. Letters from a Birmingham jail. Who writes the letters from a Birmingham jail? That is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the biggest leader and symbol of the civil rights movement. So if he's the one that wrote them, obviously that's going to go in our civil rights movement, right? 12-hour workday. Well, we keep talking about how in the Gilded Age, things were kind of really bad for workers. Working conditions were very long. We had very long work days, the 12-hour workday going on, all of these brutal work conditions, very unsafe conditions that we talk about. And the progressive era is kind of responding to that 12-hour workday. We get the 8-hour workday you are familiar with during the progressive era. Andrew Carnegie. What business is Andrew Carnegie known for? What does he make? He makes steel, Carnegie Steel, right? You know, your Steelers, your Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, where do they get their name from? From the steel industry, right? Andrew Carnegie produces steel during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. How does he make so much steel so cheap? That's a Bessemer process that we'll talk about is kind of what makes Andrew Carnegie his millions and millions of dollars. Something we've already talked about a couple of times. I'm not going to do a ton of context on it. What gets kicked off by the stock market crash? Great Depression, right? You should know. Great Depression. Corrupt government. Well, when do we have a huge problem with a corrupt government? That is during the Gilded Age. Politicians are being bought and paid for, right? We have that old political cartoon you guys might remember where it's the picture of the Senate and you have those big old giant money bags up top kind of controlling their puppets, the members of the Senate, right? And during the Progressive Era, we try to respond to that corruption in the government. Growth of our auto industry. Now, technically, this happens a couple of times that we get the growth of our auto industry. This can kind of go into the Roaring 20s if it was on here. However, the Roaring 20s isn't on here, right? So when's our next best time for the growth of the auto industry? The 1950s. We had a huge explosion in the 1950s for our growth of our auto industry, mainly because we also get the creation of our interstate highway system in the 1950s because of a cool guy named Eisenhower, who we mentioned earlier, right? He's a general at first, and then he goes on to be president, and he makes us an interstate highway system where we get all connected and we grow the car industry. Grandfather clause. This is something we talked a little bit about. My class took a test that some people didn't have to take because of the grandfather clause. If you remember that literacy test that we took, that was it really used to test literacy? No, it was used to make you fail, right? But why did you have to take that literacy test? Well, that literacy test was used to determine whether or not you were allowed to vote. But big but, who didn't have to take that literacy test? People that were grandfathered in, people that had an ancestor alive that was capable of voting before 1867. Well, that's an interesting year to pick. Why might we pick the year 1867 to grandfather in people that were already allowed to vote? Well, let's think back. What happened before 1867 that might keep people from being able to vote? Oh yeah, the system of slavery throughout the United States, right? That was specifically for people of color, mostly Black people, right? So this grandfather clause was something that was being used to prevent people of color from being able to vote in elections, right? We respond to this in the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement responds to the grandfather clause. Our muckrakers. Haven't talked about the muckrakers in a little while. They're pretty cool. Guy like Upton Sinclair is a big part of the muckraker movement with his writing The Jungle that kind of exposes all of the problems in the meat packing industry. Remember, the muckrakers, they're down in the dirt and the muck, and they're raking out the stories to expose them to the country, right? And say what's wrong with our country, what the big problems of the day are. And that is a big part of our progressive era, The poll tax. Poll taxes, you had to pay money to be allowed to vote. That sounds crazy, right? You used to have to pay money to be able to vote. That is something that goes away with the 24th Amendment. 24th Amendment gets passed during what? The Civil Rights Movement. Let me get a drink of water. Almost done, guys. Almost done. Almost. So, poll taxes, Civil Rights Movement. Then we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, All those women burn up and die in a fire in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. When we've been talking about bad working conditions, the Gilded Age, what responds to those Gilded Age conditions? The Progressive Era and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, right? We get some regulations, right? They weren't allowed to take bathroom breaks, and they locked the door to prevent them from being able to. There wasn't any well-maintained fire escapes. They fall off the building. The fire department that goes to respond to the fire, their ladder isn't long enough to get up to the building, the story of the building that's on fire, right? There's all these things that we're like, oh crap, maybe there should be some like rules and laws on how a business operates and like what we should do to respond to these types of businesses should there be an emergency. Maybe there should be some plans in place, right? So we don't have over 100 women die in a fire in the factories. So Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, the Progressive Era. I Have a Dream speech. Do I need to tell you who gave the I Have a Dream speech? It's only the most famous speech in recent U.S. history. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What era is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in? The Civil Rights Movement. If you need me to explain that one, we need to do some studying time. You should come to tutorials to get some help and prepare for this test. World War II soldiers return home. That is in our 1950s era of prosperity. 1950s era of prosperity. We get all the soldiers returning home. Everybody's super happy. The economy's doing well. So what do we have? A bunch of babies, because we can afford to have them and things are going well, right? That's when we get the baby boom. The baby boom happens with the return of all those U.S. soldiers. Well, we got to take care of our soldiers once we get home. We want to make sure that they have good opportunities set up for them when they're coming home. So we pass the GI Bill that gives them access to new forms of education, some college scholarships, basically, some cheap home loans on the GI Bill for all these guys. Again, our era of prosperity during the 1950s. Last little section, it'll go super quick. I've been saying all year that every war we talk about, there is a Congressional Medal of Honor winner from that war. Odds are there will be at very least one question on one of these guys. We'll have a question about one of these soldiers from one of the wars that gets the Congressional Medal of Honor. So let's review a little bit about the Congressional Medal of Honor. World War I, who gets the Congressional Medal of Honor? Which soldier is that? We said this is the guy that goes on a Call of Duty kill streak in real life. Alvin York is his name. Alvin York gets the Congressional Medal of Honor in World War I because he kills 25 German soldiers. That's a crazy number in real life. He gets to call in a nuke, right? Not really, since, you know, it's World War I. We don't have them yet. And also that's not a real thing outside of Call of Duty. But, and he captures 135 prisoners, right? So that's Alvin York. Well, we just talked about World War I. What's the next big war that we talk about after World War I? Take a guess. World War II. It's the next big war that we talk about. So you can fill in World War II. This is the guy that in 1945, he slipped a minefield and barbed wire and German defenses to single-handedly remove 3 machine gun nests and 2 observation posts and 2 bunkers. Fun fact about this guy, actually not really so fun fact, about this guy. He doesn't receive his Congressional Medal of Honor during World War II, right? Why does he not receive his Congressional Medal of Honor during World War II? He doesn't actually get his Congressional Medal of Honor all the way until the 1990s. This guy doesn't get his Congressional Medal of Honor. Well, why is it that it takes so long for this guy to get a Congressional Medal of Honor? It is because he was not eligible for the Congressional Medal of Honor at the time because he was African American. This is Vernon Baker, the winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor, or one of the winners of the Congressional Medal of Honor during World War II. And he was Black and won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his service in World War II, but he doesn't get the medal until the 1990s is when Vernon Baker gets his Congressional Medal of Honor. So we're going to skip a war. We actually technically don't talk about the Korean War and the Congressional Medal of Honor. I lied a little bit. But if I'm saying we're skipping the Korean War, what's the next major war that we talk about? That is the Vietnam War. And it is Roy Benavidez. The name's already there for you on who wins this one. Roy Benavidez wins the Congressional Medal of Honor in the Vietnam War. And he wins it because he helps evacuate a bunch of soldiers while wounded. He helps evacuate, I believe it's 7. Is it 7? Let me look at the key. 8. My bad. 8. I'm downplaying them. He helps evacuate 8 soldiers while wounded. He had already been shot, and he pulls out 8 other soldiers and helps them get evacuated from enemy territory, right? We'll watch Forrest Gump later on in the year, and there's actually kind of a scene in Forrest Gump based off this guy, Roy Benavidez, that we'll talk about. What do all these guys have in common? What did they do? Some crazy military stuff. They performed above and beyond the requirements of soldiers. They showed some exceptional courage in battle. Real cool guys in war. That's what they all have in common, right? We're done. I finished on this one. I'm going to stop the recording before I go completely insane today. Bye. See you in part 2.